This is the Winkle Report with your host, Ferd Winkle. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ferd Winkle, and welcome to the Winkle Report, where we keep our eyes open so you don't have to. Tonight, we're talking about propaganda, which has become a major problem, especially in social media. And we brought in an expert familiar with the subject, CJ Ackright from Paz. Welcome to the show, CJ. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you, Ferd. I'm happy to be here.
CJ, why don't you start by telling us what propaganda is?
Propaganda is the influencing of social opinion or behavior through the use of biased or misleading information. It manipulates the truth to create an us versus them scenario, where emotional reactions, usually fear and anger, dominate rational thought.
You make it sound sinister.
Make no mistake, Ferd, it is sinister. It's a tool used by those in power or those desiring power to control and manipulate people in order to achieve their ends.
What subjects are propaganda generally concerned with?
The focus of propaganda is usually centered around one of four topics: race, religion, politics, or culture. For instance, USA Today analyzed the 3,517 ads that had been placed by the Russians during the last election cycle and found out that more than half, 1,950, made direct references to race. The Russians set up dummy groups and multiple fake Facebook pages and played racial groups against each other in order to sow mistrust and discord.
What kind of propaganda do they use to do this?
Well, there are a number of propaganda techniques, but the most commonly used can be lumped into three broad categories: demonization, the halo effect, and card stacking. Demonization can range from name-calling to the big lie. Name-calling allows one group to separate another group from the main population by using a derogatory, negative word or phrase.
Well, that doesn't seem too bad. Everybody is called names.
Name-calling is insidious, Ferd, and a very effective propaganda tool. It isolates individuals and groups from one another and creates barriers that are difficult to cross. It forces the message group, the group receiving the propaganda, to ignore the common grounds they have with the target group, the group the propaganda is targeting, and turns the target group from people you can care about to objects, things not worthy of consideration. Any rational discussion of differences is lost by the emotional barrier this bias creates. Name-calling radicalizes both groups and makes it more difficult to reconcile differences, especially as message group members are afraid of being isolated or ostracized if they object or show too much support for the target group.
Really?
In many ways, our identities are defined by the groups we give allegiance to, and we often capitulate our feelings in order to support our groups, be they social, religious, or political.
Okay. What's the next one?
The big lie. The big lie is an outrageous claim that has no bearing on fact. For instance, if the target group takes over, they will enslave the males, rape the women, and eat the babies.
Well, that's ridiculous. How can anybody believe anything like that?
Actually, a variation of this was used in the recent past. A recurring theme during the previous administration was that there was a black conspiracy to overthrow the government and steal the wealth of the white population. It didn't make any sense and was obviously false, but it was accepted by a large number of people and created ill will and mistrust just by being stated and repeated. The main tool of propaganda is fear. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown. We pay attention to fear and threats no matter how real they are. Propaganda makes its target into a threat. And no matter how outrageous the claim, we pay attention to it because a threat may mean life or death. The more often the big lie is repeated, the more likely it is to be believed, because repetition gives it validity. For if it were not true, why would we keep hearing it? A threat, real or not, creates fear, and fear generates anger and hatred. With a halo effect, the symbols that are used with a piece of propaganda can enhance its believability. A flag, a coffin, even a dog can make a message seem more meaningful. And religious icons are common, as they give the message a sense of acceptance and approval by a higher authority. Also, if the message is delivered by an authority figure, it becomes a testimonial, and we are even more inclined to accept its validity, as we tend to trust authority figures within our group. One way the halo effect was used during the last election cycle was to have the flag portrayed and the message state that anyone who was against the flag was against the country. The message was deliberately vague and no groups were named. The receiver of the message, therefore, felt that since he was for the flag and patriotic, the only ones this could mean would be those who were against what he stood for. this person or group would have to be the ones the message was referring to. Now in reality there was no such group. The purpose of these memes was solely to generate vague fear and mistrust through implication. It kept anxiety levels up and maintained tension because there wasn't a specific target for anyone to vent on. So they chose their perceived social political rivals. It was very effective. With card stacking, whatever information is used is selected to create the desired effect. Any information to the contrary is avoided or slanted to show support for the message. Taking statements or a picture out of context is a common method of slanting a message. Card stacking is controlling the type and manner or spin of the message to enhance its acceptance.
Are those it?
No, like I said, there are many techniques. But when you look at propaganda material, these three are the most often used, singly or in combination with each other.
No offense, but they seem pretty simple.
Simple can be very effective. KISS. In the last election cycle, the Russians created false identities or sock puppets for social media and made themselves part of opposing groups. They then distributed their propaganda posing as members of the American political scene and were able to play both sides. This was effective because, as sock puppets, they had established legitimacy within those groups.
What makes these methods so effective?
Propaganda sparks an emotional reaction in the message group by triggering a response from what we call a GDB, or genetic determinant of behavior.
What's a genetic determinant of behavior?
We inherit any number of traits from our parents in terms of bone structure, eyes, hair, etc. We also know that we can inherit some physical and emotional disorders through our genetic heritage, like hemophilia and cystic fibrosis, or schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. There are also certain behavioral characteristics that are transmitted genetically as well. These are GDBs.
What kinds of behavior?
Here we're talking about those most concerned with survival.
What does a GDB have to do with this?
Since life began on this planet, only one thing has mattered: survival. If you survived and reproduced, your DNA would continue to circulate in the species gene pool. If you did not survive, your genetic heritage was lost. If you did reproduce, those traits which enabled you to do so were inherited by your progeny. Over 4 billion years of evolutionary processes hardwired certain survival characteristics into our genome.
What kind of survival characteristics?
Specifically, our reaction to threat and our innate deference to authority figures. For instance, as I said before, we react to any threat, real or not, because of the potential danger it represents. In the past, if we didn't, there was a chance we could die. Those that did react had a better chance to survive and reproduce. We have inherited that reaction to threat survival characteristic. Also, we evolved as group animals. We didn't have claws or fangs and weren't especially big or strong. Our best individual chances for survival and reproduction were enhanced by the protection the group could afford. The group leader was responsible for the group's well-being, and individuals deferred to his authority because of his knowledge and ability. We also deferred, rather than risk possible exile from the group, as protection and support. 4 billion years of evolution has conditioned us to obey those in authority. And while things have changed considerably since the dawn of civilization, changing that conditioning is like changing the habits of a lifetime in less than half a second.
Okay. So anyway, you're saying that these genetic determinants of behavior are responsible for both our reaction to potential danger, threats, and our deference to authority.
Yes. GDBs predispose us to react in certain ways in certain situations.
And propaganda targets these GDBs.
The idea is to spark an emotional reaction in the message group that will cause them to support whatever is being espoused by that message.
So how do we counteract these messages?
It takes time to research messages. And most of us assume that any message we receive from an accepted source is valid, and we seldom question it. When we talk about groups, the group we identify with is the one we have to trust. For if we do not believe or accept what the group is proposing, we may be exiled from that group and lose their support. This is how we evolved, because in the past, loss of group protection could be the equivalent of a death sentence.
What about reason and facts?
Reason and facts become secondary as emotional biases are created. Also, any emotional content in the rebuttal could be seen as a form of aggressive display, and the factual content ignored as the other group responds with aggressive display of its own. The argument then gets sidetracked and is lost in emotional diatribe.
What do you mean by aggressive display?
Back when we were still picking fleas out of our fur, a leader was the protector of his group. Aggressive display was a way to contest for leadership without killing off the warriors and weakening the protective strength of the group. This display, beating of the chest, roaring out challenge, etc., increased until one or the other backed down or violence ensued, but the idea was to get a leader without too much bloodshed. One of the reasons the present president is able to get away with so much is that he's constantly beating his chest and roaring out challenge. First, he glad hands his followers to get their approval and admits aggressive display to cement his leadership position. Then, if he's confronted, he throws out a red herring.
Glad hand, red herring, what are those?
Glad handing someone is where you give them positive feedback to elicit their support. The technique is to get their agreement and or commitment to something small and gradually work your way up to bigger things so that by the time you get to the real point, they're already pretty much committed to your position. A red herring is anything designed to divert attention away from the real subject. It's misdirection and obfuscation.
And these are all propaganda techniques as well?
They are all social influencing techniques that are frequently used with propaganda.
But reason and facts are still the best response to make, right?
Yes, but again, the reason should be devoid of emotional content. And there is a danger that a group that is backed into a corner by reason will become more emotional and irrational as they attempt to hold on to their unreasonable position. In the process, they may become more extreme in their behavior.
You make it sound pretty hopeless.
No, it's not hopeless. But the best way to thwart propaganda is to be aware of it. Awareness allows you to choose and ask yourself the important questions. If the cause is so just and righteous, why do they need to manipulate me into agreeing with it? And whose interests are they really representing? If you're not aware, you'll react just like you're expected to and be played like a puppet on a string. What you do not appreciate intellectually, you will experience emotionally.
Thank you, CJ, for your insights into this knotty problem. What you do not appreciate intellectually, you will experience emotionally. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. This has been the Winkle Report.